over on June 2nd. So
Got it.
All right, let's get started.
okay.
Welcome everyone. This is a little bit of a different format than we usually do for our East End YIMBY meetings, which is more of a webinar format. So you won't see, the participants won't see yourselves on the screen. We're just doing that for just ease of, we really want to hear from the Assemblyman. My name is Bryony Freij. I am a leader of East End YIMBY, a resident of Sag Harbor Village. Our mission at East End YIMBY is to do the research, to identify solutions, and to educate local East End community members about all the complex issues surrounding affordable community housing. And last fall, Governor Kathy Hochul signed the Peconic Bay Community Housing Fund Act, sponsored by Assemblyman Thiele, which authorizes each of the 5 East End towns to establish a community housing fund. The law is subject to a referendum vote come November in each of the 5 East End towns. So we are honored to share the next hour with Assemblyman Thiele, who has been working on getting this housing fund legislation passed, I understand, for the last 20 years. So it's finally here before us on November 8th, and we are so grateful for all the work that you've done. We organized tonight's webinar not to talk about the problems of, the crisis that we're in. We all know that. We want to focus on solutions, and you only need to look at how incredibly successful community preservation funds have been in preserving open space and farmland to realize the importance of having a dedicated fund specifically for affordable community housing. And the legislation we're going to be discussing tonight is sort of like the sister to the CPF. We're just 7 months away from the November election, and towns are actually prohibited from advocating for the referendum. So this is really up to us, local leaders, community members, voters, to organize, get the word out on getting this passed. In addition to some of the just wonderful individuals on this call, we have leaders from several important local organizations who are doing a lot of this work with us, and we're really looking forward to collaborating with them to sort of have a united front on how to present this legislation to the East End and make sure that it passes. So Michael Daly, our founder, will be facilitating the Q&A following Mr. Thiele's presentation. At the bottom of your screen, near the right, you'll see the Q&A button. So you're welcome to click on that. Please don't put it in the chat, put it in the Q&A box. You might want to wait until Mr. Thiele has sort of come to the end of his talk, because I'm sure a lot of your questions should be answered while he's speaking. And then Michael will read questions aloud, and we'll, get into some dialogue. And we did, if you're just joining us now, but we did talk earlier about that just yesterday, Assemblyman Thiele introduced affordable housing legislation around accessory dwelling units to the New York State Assembly. And if time allows, maybe we can have an opportunity to discuss those bills as well. And we were grateful with your ongoing work on this. But today we really want to focus on this, this community housing fund. How can we garner the support that we need in this community to really get this passed in November? So Michael, did I get everything is there anything you want to add, or can we hand it over to the Assemblyman?
Perfect. Let's go.
All right. The mic is yours.
Well, thank you. And thanks to both of you for East End YIMBY for sponsoring this. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm gonna basically do 2 things, I think, in my presentation. One is to explain what the legislation does, how the fund would work, what the fund would do, how it would be financed, basically the details of the fund. And then I'm going to talk about the process, because there are a number of steps that the town has to complete before they can implement the fund and actually utilize the fund. So as you said at the outset of this, and that is, Peconic Bay community housing legislation. I think the first bill for that was introduced in about, it was like 2002. It was literally just about 20 years ago. And, the way I describe it in one way is, Bryony, as you said, it's kind of the sister bill of the Community Preservation Fund. The East End, each of the 5 East End towns voted to create a community preservation fund back in 1998 through a referendum, which is a dedicated fund where the proceeds of the fund, a 2% real estate transfer tax, the fund is utilized to acquire land for preservation, and also now a portion of the fund can be used for water quality pursuant to a voter referendum. But from the early days of the Community Preservation Fund, which was very successful from the beginning, I think it was recognized that housing was an issue on the East End, and that we needed companion legislation. Yes, we needed preservation on one end, preserve our water quality, preserve our rural character, but we also needed this to be an affordable place for people to live if we were going to have a balanced community where the people that work here and live here can afford to be here. So the bill was for housing, it had been around for a long time, never got any traction. It was hard to even get a Senate sponsor for this legislation for many, many years. But as the housing crisis has worsened, there was greater and greater support. And in 2019, we got the bill passed, but the former governor vetoed the bill. We had to start all over again. And then with the housing crisis even being further exacerbated by the pandemic, the legislature passed the bill overwhelmingly again. And the new governor, Governor Kathy Hochul, signed the bill into law last October. So, it's a little bit of the background and how we got here. So what does the bill do? What is the Peconic Bay Region Community Housing Fund? Well, it's authorizing legislation. It authorizes local government to do something. It doesn't mandate that they do it. It gives them the authority to do that, to do this. And that is, it gives them the authority to create a community housing fund. And this would be a fund that would be dedicated to one purpose, and it would be dedicated to the purpose of providing community housing for the East End. And I should point out I've already seen one question with regard to this. Each town has its own discrete fund. The legislation affects all 5 towns, but each town is a separate unit. So Southampton could decide to put it on the ballot. Riverhead might decide not to. Or if one town passes it and another town doesn't pass it, it's not all interdependent. So if Southampton does it, it's effective in Southampton. If Riverhead doesn't do it, well, then Riverhead doesn't do it. Doesn't affect Southampton or Southold or Shelter Island. So it's a regional bill, but each town is on its own as far as creating the fund. And, the purposes of the fund is really to create community housing opportunities. And it really allows the fund to be utilized for every possible option that towns already possess. They can use the fund for financial assistance for home buyers, things such as down payment assistance or shared equity. The shared equity concept has been talked about as a way of getting more housing out here in reach. So financial assistance to home buyers is one way that the fund can be used. It can be used for the construction of rental housing. It can be used for the construction of housing for home ownership. It could be public-private partnerships. It could be the rehabilitation of existing buildings for housing purposes. So the fund is very, very flexible. The authority that the towns have it gives them a wide range of options of how to deal with their housing situation, because Southold is different than Shelter Island. Riverhead is different than Southampton. Each town has, different circumstances, different situations. The idea is we're going to give you the authority to create the fund. You'll have to decide what tools, what options are the best for you. Is it to focus more on financial assistance to first-time home buyers? Are there opportunities for construction? Those are local decisions that would be made by the towns. And so because of that, it's a broad cross-section of various options that the towns have for community housing. The critical part of this, I think one of the most important parts of this, is that before the fund, any money can be expended from the fund, the towns have to construct and have to pass a community housing plan. It's an implementation plan. They basically, it really serves two purposes. First, because there's a referendum requirement, which I'll get to later, the purpose of the plan is to tell voters who have to vote on this in November, how is the town going to spend the money? What is it, how they're going to use the money? The town's going to be able to raise a lot of money, for housing purposes. How are they going to spend it? Because voters deserve to know, how the dollars are going to be used if they vote for this. So one is to inform the public and voters about how, what the town's philosophy is, how they think the fund should be implemented. And second, it is the roadmap for actual implementation. So, the plan will really inform the town as to, what strategies they're going to use with regard to affordable housing. I should point out that there also is the need for an advisory committee. That each town would create an advisory committee to help the town board in creating a community housing plan. So, dedicated fund. I've talked about the purposes of the fund. I've talked about the need for a plan for implementation of the fund. And I've talked about the fact that there's an advisory committee to help the town board put that plan together. The creation of the fund, the creation of the plan, all have to be adopted by the town board by local law, which means there has to be a public hearing. The public needs to be involved in all of this. So that's the fund. And then on the other side is the financing of the fund. What's the funding source? Well, it is an additional 0.5% addition to the real estate transfer tax. Currently, there's a 2% transfer tax that goes into the community preservation fund. There would be a separate 0.5% that would go into the housing fund. And these are two separate funds. We're not putting housing into the community preservation fund. There's two separate dedicated funds, but they share a similar funding source. But they are separate. It would be the same. The town has a police fund. The town has a highway fund. They're both funded by the property tax. They both are funded by the same form of revenue, but they're two separate and dedicated funds. That's going to be the same with the community preservation fund and the community housing fund. So it would be an additional 0.5%, but at the same time, on the South Fork, we would be increasing the exemption on the tax also. Currently in Shelter Island, Southampton, and East Hampton, the first 250,000 is exempt from the tax. That would be increased on the entire 2.5% would be increased to 400,000. So what that means is that if your transaction is $1 million or less, you would actually pay less in tax now, because we're not trying to impact the lower end of the housing market here by making it more expensive. On the North Fork, the existing exemption is 150,000. It would go to 200,000. So that's your dedicated fund. That's your revenue source. So what is the process now? The legislature has acted. The governor signed the bill. The legal authorization is there for the towns. And now the ball is in the court of each individual town. And as you mentioned, we're about 7 months away from Election Day. Probably closer to 6.5 now, but the clock is ticking on that. So, the threshold question for each town is each town has to decide for themselves whether they or not they want to create the fund, number one, and number two, do they want to do it in time for a referendum this November? And, I know that I'm not sure about Riverhead, but I think, from talking to Southold and Shelter Island and Southampton and East Hampton, they're all preparing for a November referendum. I'm just not sure about what Riverhead is doing. So they have to take a couple of actions. As I mentioned, they have to pass a local law that would create the fund, that would actually establish the fund. They would also have to, as part of that local law or in a separate local law, would have to adopt or a law to impose the real estate transfer tax. So they have to do that. And they have to have a public hearing first before they can do that. And then the other part of it is that before Election Day, they also need to prepare their housing plan, which I referenced before. They also would have to have a public hearing on their housing plan. And again, would have to be adopted by local law. So the towns have to pass a local law for creating the fund, imposing the tax. They also have to pass a local law for the implementation of the housing fund. And then all of that is subject to a mandatory referendum, which would be required this November if towns decide to move ahead this year. So, and basically the towns have to have all of that work done by early August. The deadline to get this on the ballot is early in August. I think August 8th, 90 days before the election. So the towns will have to have that work done. So, November is more than 6 months away, but August isn't. It's only about 3 months away. And I think, a critical part of this is engaging the public in the discussion. I think the towns need to, make the public part of the process, get their input early as to what is the best way to implement this fund to deal with the housing crisis that each of the towns are dealing with. So I think time is of the essence to get the public involved. And I know the towns are beginning to do that. So the last thing that I'll just mention is well, what kind of money does this generate for affordable housing? And it's a little hard to estimate in some ways at the moment, because the real estate transfer tax is sensitive to real estate market activities, and that can be at times a little bit volatile. After the Great Recession in 2008, the Community Preservation Fund was only generating about $40 or $50 million a year. And then, on average, it was generating about $90 million a year for most of the last decade. But then during the pandemic, real estate activity has been at a frenzy. Last year, the Community Preservation Fund generated across the 5 towns $210 million in 2021. Now, that's a spike. Those numbers can't continue, but kind of trying to figure out the average of where things are, with the increase in the tax and the increase in the exemption. If you took the average of the last 10 years before the pandemic, you would estimate that this fund across the 5 towns would generate somewhere between $20 and $25 million a year for community housing. So I'm going to stop with that. I've took a good 20, 25 minutes kind of giving the overview, and I'm certainly glad to try to answer any questions that anybody might have, with regard to the purposes of the fund or the procedures that the town has to go go through to be able to implement the fund. Any questions that people might have.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred Thiele. So a couple of questions that have been asked so far is if towns are prohibited to advocate for the legislation, how are they best going to get the word out? Our understanding is that
Yeah,
they're able to educate but not advocate.
It's a fine line, right? I mean, towns cannot advocate. You cannot use taxpayers' dollars to, for example, to put out a mailing that says, from the town of Southampton or from the town of East Hampton, vote yes on Proposition 1, the Community Housing Fund. That is an illegal and an unconstitutional expenditure of town dollars, because you can't use town dollars to advocate to vote one way or another on a public referendum. What the towns can do is educational pieces. They could do basically what I just did over the last 25 minutes, which is to say, this proposition is on the ballot this November. This is what the Community Preservation Fund is. This is what is in the plan. This is how the towns would use the money. This is, what would occur. What the specifics are. You can tell them what the specifics of the plan are. You can educate people. You simply can't say vote yes. And it gets tricky sometimes. I always tell towns, local governments to kind of stay away from the line here. When does education become advocacy? And I think towns need to be careful. So the towns can educate people about what the proposition, what the referendum, what the legislation is all about, and tell people, what it would do. They just can't say, they can't say, vote yes. And so
But we can.
But yeah, so, it really is left to people outside. And by the way, that doesn't mean that, myself as a state assemblyman, or, Peter Van Scoyac as the town supervisor in East Hampton, or Jerry Siller in Shelter Island, they can certainly say that they support the referendum. They just can't expend town resources in that regard. They're allowed to have their opinion and their First Amendment rights. So people need to be aware of that. But, it really is up to advocates, in the community who think this is a good idea to come together and really to advocate, organizations like East End YIMBY that would support this. I mean, for example, I'll use the Community Preservation Fund as an example. There was a broad-based coalition of organizations that supported the Community Preservation Fund. Yes, there were civic associations, there were environmental groups, there was the Nature Conservancy, the group for the East End, the Peconic Land Trust, but there was also builders. There was the Bridgehampton National Bank, banks, real estate brokers, a broad cross section of stakeholders that came together and formed a coalition and advocated and ran a campaign in favor of that. And and certainly that is something that is permitted, and people can do that in favor and they can do that opposed to the proposition. But I think kind of key and critical to to the passage of the referendum, as I said, the towns can educate people as to what the proposition's all about. It'll be up to the advocates to really advocate for a yes vote on the proposition.
Got it. Fred, another question is, are the towns tied to the housing roadmaps or plans, and how are they allowed to change over time?
Yeah, just like the Community Preservation Fund, the plans can be amended from time to time in the future. In fact, I think the law that we did requires that they be updated every 5 years. So, once the plan's in place, and the expiration date for the tax is 2050. So, the funding source is in place for the next, if it's approved, 27, 28 years. but the plan certainly can be amended, to reflect changing priorities through the years. But initially, and I see in the question, I think it's Jerry Siller says, legally, the housing plan does not need to be adopted before the referendum. I would highly discourage anybody from putting this on the ballot without first doing the housing plan, because I think that's a proposition for failure. The law actually says you can't expend money from the fund until you adopt the plan. But I'm urging all the towns that it would be a mistake to not have a housing plan in place and tell the public how you're going to use the fund without having the housing plan in place first.
Yeah, that was a little bit, there's been a little bit of clarity on that needed. So does the housing plan have to be in place before the referendum?
Legally,
Or
it doesn't.
not?
It only has to be in place before you can spend money.
But you're
I
thinking
just
it's a good
think
job to
that,
have it, yeah.
the plan forms a dual function. It's not only the roadmap for how the money can be spent, legally, once it's implemented. It is also, I think, it tells the public how you intend to use the fund.
Right.
And, it's my belief that, if you put this on the ballot and don't tell people how you're going to, implement the fund, I don't think you're putting your best foot forward in getting the public to support it. My experience with referenda, whether they're for open space or public works or whatever, is that, the public will vote for a dollar. They'll give you $1 to spend if you tell them how you're going to spend it, and they think it's and you're spending it on a good reason. If they're not clear on how you're going to spend it, I think they're much more reluctant to give you a yes vote. So, so just some clarification there. It's not legally required, but I think it is important to have the housing plans.
You're encouraging towns to do that. Fred, does ag labor housing fit into this, or is that going to be something decided by each township?
Yeah, and I think employee housing is a big issue here. I mentioned public-private partnerships. Another way of saying that certainly is the potential for the town to work as far as employee housing goes. And in our communities, I think, agricultural housing is certainly part of that. The hospitality industry, restaurants, hotels, they certainly big industry in our town. But even our big employers, I think you're seeing in a lot of cases where employers, especially bigger employers, they find it critical to acquire housing as part of their business to house their employees. That's how desperate things have gotten here. So the towns through this, that kind of employer housing where the town can provide assistance in that regard is something that's permitted under the fund also.
Good. Fred, another question is, assuming the referendum passes in November, how long do you think it'll take to start seeing the benefits of this program? When would the funds likely to start to flow and assist folks in need? And there's also an issue around bonding, which I think is possible that you might explain.
Yeah, let me say two things about that. One is there's a little bit of a lag because of the way the state tax law works, which is separate and apart from us. But for example, when we did the Community Preservation Fund, it passed in November. You have to start on a quarter. So the earliest, and I think, you have to give at least 60 days from the effective date before you can impose the tax. So the earliest, if it was approved in November, the earliest that the towns could start collecting the money would be the second quarter, April 1st would be the start. So that's when the revenue would begin to flow. And, the experience here is that, it takes a little bit of time, obviously, for that to begin as, closings and things occur, because contracts that are entered into before April 1st are exempt. So, the real estate process, there's an offer, there's an agreement, you got to do the contract, you got to do the closing. It takes a while for that. So, but you would expect April 1st to be the effective date if it passes. The one thing that you should be aware of is that you can bond against the revenue stream. Again, if you remember with the Community Preservation Fund, towns projected their revenue and borrowed against it because they wanted to preserve land before it disappeared. Similarly here, towns could bond against the revenue and jumpstart their housing program with a 20-year bond that projects out what they would anticipate collecting. What I've always told the towns with the Community Preservation Fund, and I would say the same thing here, is you have to be very conservative in bonding. If your conservative estimate is that the fund is going to generate, I'm going to use an arbitrary number, but $100 million, I might do bond against half of it and use the rest as pay as you go. You don't want to be in a position where you don't have enough revenue to pay the bonds. The towns have been very successful in not having to do that by being conservative in their bonding strategy, but you can bond against the fund. So you don't have to wait for the money to come in. You can bond against it. The towns just need to be conservative in their revenue estimates so that the amount that they bond and the debt service they have to pay back doesn't exceed the revenue that's coming in.
Fred, here's another question. What alternative does a town have if it misses the August deadline? I guess.
Yeah, this isn't do it this year or you can't do it. So, if a town doesn't make the deadline this year, they could do it next year. They could do it the year after. Basically, the towns have the authority. There's nothing in the law that says that the referendum has to be in 2022. I think most towns have made the judgment that the crisis is so severe that there's no time to waste and they want to get something on the ballot this November, but they're not mandated to do that. I mean, if they felt they needed more time to prepare their plan or they needed more time to do outreach to the public, they certainly legally have the ability to do the referendum in a subsequent year. So there's nothing in the statute. It's not one and done. So, you have the ability, certainly, if you don't do it in 2022, it doesn't mean you couldn't do it in a subsequent year.
Got it. Another question is, there's a couple of questions around the housing plans, Fred, which I don't, again, you're not doing the housing plans, that each township is going to create their own. So for instance, one question is, and maybe you can address these, is what does a housing plan look like? Is the public input being sought? And we know the answer to that is yes. Southampton has just passed or just voted on their legislation, is going to release their plan in the next month and start holding public meetings on that plan in the next month or two. But another question around that was, are towns going to indicate the % of funds for each of the purposes identified in their plan? And I don't know if you could really answer that or just.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple of different things. I'll kind of take a crack at some of them. What has to be in the plan? I mean, the towns have flexibility. Each town's a little bit different. But I think, one of the things that the town certainly should do is, the law identifies different purposes for which the fund can be utilized. And, we've talked about some of them tonight. So I think the town should do an analysis, certainly, of, which one of these purposes, which one of the tools that are in the toolbox, which ones are they going to use and what proportions are they going to use them? The law also has standards that the towns have to meet, smart growth principles. No one community, no one hamlet should bear a disproportionate burden of meeting the housing need. There shouldn't be an over concentration in any one community. Every community should have a responsibility, to play a part in dealing with the housing crisis. So those are the kinds of things that I think should be addressed in the plan. You know, what tools are they going to use? You know, what criteria is the town going to look for in identifying sites in those cases where they might be looking to, you know, construct a rental project or a home ownership project? You know, what are the standards that they're going to look to meet, and how do they comply with the law? So, you know, those are certainly some of the things. As far as percentages, there's nothing in the state law. You know, this is a home rule bill. It allows the local governments to do that. I mean, if a local government, for example, decided that their best approach was, hey, we're going to focus more on making existing housing stock more affordable. We're going to put a lot of money into financial assistance for home buyers. And if they wanted to put a percentage on that in their local law, they could do that. They're not required to do that. They could put it in their plan. They could put it in the local law. But, you know, they're not required to do that. You know, if they wanted to devote a certain amount to new home construction or to rental projects, they could do that. But that's what the planning process should be about, is identifying what tools they want to use and in what proportions they want to use it. And, you know, I don't have to say that the reason why we left it flexible is because the towns are so different. You know, what Riverhead needs to do, you know, which is, you know, I think most people would perceive to be already more of an affordable community to live in, compared to what real estate prices are, you know, in East Hampton or in Amagansett or in Southampton, and you know, what tools they might want to use there. I mean, we didn't want to hamstring the local governments. We wanted to give them parameters, but let them make the decisions about how this fund, you know, could be best utilized. It would be the same, again, to use the Community Preservation Fund analogy. You know, the state didn't tell you know, the town of Southampton or the town of East Hampton, you got to spend 20% of it on the Pine Barrens. You got to spend 15% on farmland. You got to spend 40% on wetlands, or you know how to do it. We left it to local government to set their own priorities. And I think Albany provides the authorization, and then I think our job as the state is to get out of the way and let the local government, working with their constituents, to devise the plans the best way they can, to get the best results for what that town needs to deal with affordable housing.
Good, thank you. There's a number of kind of similar questions around doing this now, and do you feel that there's going to be any opposition? Like initial CPF referendum was opposed by builders and realtors. And I know we've had some meetings with some realtor organizations, but do you anticipate any opposition? And if the towns can't form the advocacy for this, how do you see that coalition being built for advocacy in time for the referendum?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to predict, as far as opposition. I will say this, I mean, I had a meeting today with the Long Island Builders Institute. They supported the legislation, and they didn't start out supporting the legislation, but we worked with them. And, we tried to come up with a bill. Obviously they haven't, it's a mixed bag for the Long Island builders. They want to build housing. That's what they do. So that, on the other hand, a real estate transfer tax, they view, I think, as a tax on their industry. So, there was a balance there. But, a key thing with them was, was increasing the exemptions, which were long overdue, which hadn't been increased since 1998. So, we tried to find some consensus with the builders. We did. And, the Long Island Board of Realtors, realtor organizations hadn't taken a formal position one way or another, but we met with them. And, And, they were very interested in increasing the exemption also. So, I don't think there's any organized opposition out there. I'm mindful of the fact that, that affordable housing, can be controversial. So, I don't minimize the fact that, that there may be opposition out there. But I think, it's really for advocates to make the case to the public as a whole, and to really make the case. And, it won't be unanimous, I can tell you that, right? I'm sure that, there may be some opposition. And, I think as far as building that coalition, I think this meetings like this one tonight are the beginning, of building that coalition. I mean, I've had conversations, not just conversations with builders and realtors. We've had conversations certainly with housing advocates like Habitat for Humanity, local employers, like Southampton Hospital, very interested in this. The Long Island Farm Bureau, there's a natural coalition there, I think, I've heard this said at some of the express sessions in one meeting that I couldn't attend because I was in Albany with the budget, but every public policy issue you discuss on the East End, whether it's traffic or the economy, employment, volunteer firemen and volunteer emergency service workers being able to, it eventually all comes down to housing. Every discussion on every public policy issue on the East End eventually gets around to, well, the reason why we have so much traffic is because people have to drive from up west to get to their jobs because they can't afford to live here. The reason why we're having trouble getting school teachers at the local school is people can't afford to live here. So, almost every issue that you deal with, there's not enough you can't find people to, the next generation of volunteer firefighters. It all comes down to affordable housing. So there is a coalition amongst all of those groups that is there to be built. It just needs to be built. And again, I was so excited to come, to be here tonight, even though I was in Albany, to be able to do this, is because I think building that coalition is very, very important.
Yeah, and we're going to be part of that. I know Shelter for All in Shelter Island is going to be part of it. Our coalition started with our rally in December, and we already have members on board, and we need to just kind of turn up the volume a little bit, notch it up. We're going to be announcing the public hearings that are going to be coming up in each of the townships as they arise. So we'll be alerting you to that, asking you to show up to participate in that. Just like, May 10th is the first hearing for the Sag Harbor legislation as well. So we're going to be busy this summer. You better get your beach time in and your advocacy swimming trunks on.
Yeah.
And then, so another question, Fred, that
I don't get a lot of beach time, but I'll be there.
Is there any sort of reliable statistics about housing needed in any of the townships or in our region? We even talk about, old numbers that were thrown out that Southampton needs 5,000 units, Riverhead needs 2,500, but is there anything reliable that you use for what we need for housing?
Well, I mean, there's been housing planning done on the county levels that, before Diana Weir retired, she had done a lot of work as far as, housing needs in Southampton. So, there's a lot of data that's out there that I think, that, by the way, I think, these plans shouldn't just tell people how to spend the money, but they should also demonstrate to people the need. And so I think those plans should try to tap into some of the work that's been done. I think the hardest thing that there's going to be out there for the towns as far as trying to identify the need is the fact that the pandemic has jolted the numbers. The pandemic in so many regards has accelerated trends that were already out there. And one of them was the fact that, more and more of the housing stock out here was being utilized for seasonal housing. I think one of the things we've dealt with is that people desiring a second house or a third house or a fourth house in some cases were able to outbid people that were here in the community trying to buy their first house. And, so you've got that. You've got things like Airbnb that, that were also, eating into the year-round housing stock. So you had all these things going on before the pandemic, and they just got accelerated. I mean, that $210 million that I mentioned that the CPF collected in 2021, those were people that were coming out here and trying to get away from the city, or wanted to be in a place that they felt was going to be safer, and that certainly was the case. And and when I say seasonal housing, I used to know what that meant, and I'm not even sure about that anymore, because when I was growing up in Sag Harbor, we'd wait for the traffic to come out on Friday night and go back on Sunday, and for years, because of technology and the fact that people did, were already able to work from out here, you'd see more traffic on a Thursday than you would on a Friday, and maybe more traffic on a Tuesday morning than you'd see on a Sunday night. Well, now you got, people are, they're not working in the office, they're working from home. And so people are spending even more and more time, on the East End. So all of these things have kind of got jumbled. So, as far as trying to quantify that, I think in the plans, I think we're in a period of transition that's going to make it hard to, and not only hard to know where we are now, but where are we going to be in 5 years as those trends continue. But the one thing I think we know is that, there's a housing crisis, and I think we need to quantify it as best we can, even though there's a lot of moving variables that are out there.
Yeah. So Fred, we see with the Community Preservation Fund that it's been used in partnerships with organizations like the Peconic Land Trust or other preservation groups. And maybe will this be available to form partnerships if the towns choose to use it that way with maybe nonprofit organizations, Habitat for Humanity,
Yes.
Other housing groups? Okay.
Yes.
And can the funds be used to incentivize private developers?
Private developers, I think it'll depend on their willingness to build affordable housing. This fund can't be used for, sometimes you get private developments where like 10% are set aside for affordability. We can't subsidize the other 90%. And it's going to depend, I think, on the willingness of that kind of public-private partnership, of being able to do things that keep that housing affordable in perpetuity. So, I think the more logical partnerships are going to be with not-for-profits, but there's, it'll be up to the towns, and they'll have to figure out, whether there's a way that they can partner with private developers.
Got it. Can you explain what shared equity housing is?
Yeah, shared equity, is one of the concepts that I think maybe has the greatest promise as far as home ownership. It was talked about in some detail on a housing meeting we had with the East Hampton School District back several months ago, and I know, I think both of you were at that meeting, and it was also something that we had identified in drafting the legislation that's been done in other communities. I'm going to use an example to try to explain how it would work. And say there was a house, which would meet the guidelines, literally at $1 million. It could be $1 million house, which is kind of, believe it or not, the lower end in some of the places on the South Fork. But you've got $1 million house, and you've got somebody who could meet the income requirements, for the Community Housing Fund, which I think under the current state guidelines, for a family of 3+, is is in excess somewhere around $120,000.
It is,
But
it is, yeah.
you know, the idea of housing equity is that you could use half the fund, up to 50%, $500,000. The town could work with a potential homeowner and say, you know, the town could put up to 500,000, because, you know, $1 million home, maybe they can't make the down payment. But the town could put up to 500,000. I'm going to use that example, the maximum, where the town helps the potential homeowner by putting $500,000 in the fund to help them buy the house. So now it's affordable for them because they only got to come up with the other 500,000, maybe between a down payment and a conventional mortgage with a bank. So it would be, you know, the shared equity is that, you know, the town would help them there, and they would not have to pay that loan from the town back until they sold the property. And the theory of that is, let's say 10 years later, they decide that, you know, they've had children, they need to move up. And let's say the house is then worth $1.5 million, you know, 10 years later. So at that time when they sell, you know, shared equity as well, the town has 50% of the equity. So they'd get 750, the homeowner would get 750. The town would take their 750 and put it back in the community housing fund to help other families. The homeowner would take their 750,000 and use it to buy their next house.
Got it. So it can be a rolling, growing fund.
Yeah, one of the
over
things
time.
that I think works with the housing fund and, you know, first assistance for home buyers that, you know, you couldn't do with the community preservation fund is, you know, you buy open space, you got to raise more taxes to buy the next piece of open space. But with the community housing fund, because of the financial assistance program, you know, as people roll in and roll out of it, you know, you get to replenish the fund. It's more of a revolving fund because your source of revenue isn't just going to be the real estate transfer tax. It's going to be those homeowners that got financial assistance, but then, you know, cycle out, and then, you know, the shared equity goes back into the fund. So that's, you know, that's one tool. Shared equity is one tool that the towns could utilize for the fund.
Got it. So the initial plans that the towns will present, if changes are made to those plans, let's say on a 5-year basis or reevaluation, will that require voter approval or just public meetings? And
yeah, it's not the plan that requires the referendum, it's the tax that requires the referendum. So the plan can be amended in the future. It doesn't require a referendum for the plan, but the plan cannot be amended without first having a public hearing.
Got it. You know, there's some people have asked, is there any way to break down that, you know, estimated $25 million that you kind of round figure in terms of how that would be distributed in the different townships? So someone from Southold was asking, because clearly their amount of money is not going to be that of Southampton.
No question. And, you know, the Community Preservation Fund and the Community Housing Fund, the real estate transfer tax, the South Fork and the North Fork are two distinct real estate markets. And there's no question that 80 to 85% of the revenue gets generated in Southampton and East Hampton. You know, those major sales that you know, if you read any of the real estate publications that are ubiquitous on the South Fork, you see those 40, 50, 60, sometimes $100 million transactions that occur on the South Fork. You know, you don't see those on the North Fork. So there's no question that, you know, the South Fork is going to generate more revenue from this than the North Fork. But, you know, again, you know, it's going to be 27, 28 years worth of revenue. You know, it can make a meaningful difference, I think, on the North Fork also. But, you know, the bulk, there's no question that, you know, Southold, for example, in a year when East Hampton generates 30 million a year, Southold's generating 7 million a year. That's kind of the order of magnitude.
Yeah. So it's 7:59, and so before we go, thank you so much for this. This education is so important, and anyone who wants to be involved in building this coalition to help advocate, educate, and get the word out, please, let's be in touch, and let's do this. We have a list of people that we know are interested in advocating for this. But before we go, Fred, could you just tell us a little bit about the legislation that you submitted and proposed yesterday in Albany regarding ADUs and affordable housing?
Sure. I'll do the Reader's Digest version of this. The governor had put a proposal in the state budget with regard to ADUs that would have been more of a mandate on local government. It kind of went over like a lead balloon. It became very controversial. The one thing there was agreement on, though, was that accessory dwelling units, accessory apartments, are a quick and meaningful way to increase affordable housing opportunities. So we want to try to promote them. And a lot of our local governments on the East End already allow for accessory dwelling units. And, places like Sag Harbor, they're looking to revise their plan and try to facilitate. There's not a lot of open land in Sag Harbor. Accessory apartments is a way to go, for example. So, my experience is, one, they need to be legal, but second, you also need to be able to get property owners that are willing to actually construct accessory dwelling units. And, there's a lot of reasons why they don't want to do it. Or if they do want to do it, they don't want to do it legally. And the communities across the country that have had the most success with accessory dwelling units are the communities that have provided incentives. And by the way, that's something that we could also do with the community housing fund, but the state needs to play a role. So the bill that the two bills that I put in yesterday, one would require not just the ones that we're talking about in the East End where they're doing housing plans, but would require all local governments to prepare a 5-year housing plan. Believe it or not, even though towns are supposed to have, villages are supposed to have comprehensive plans, they don't all have them. And a housing plan, again, a plan, if you want to know, where to put your resources, having a plan is a good idea. But the incentives for accessory dwelling units, one would be a forgivable loan fund that the state housing and community renewal agency would run, where you could provide capital up to $75,000 for the construction of an ADU. It would be a forgivable loan. It would start out as a loan, but if you built your accessible dwelling unit and kept it affordable for 20 years, the loan would be forgiven, and it would be it would become a grant. So one of the biggest roadblocks to to constructing ADUs is the rather large capital outlay that people have to come up with. So by having a state forgivable loan program would be one way to attack that. The other two incentives are tax incentives. An income tax incentive that would provide an income tax credit of 50% up to $10,000 of the difference between the affordable rent and what the market rent would be. So again, I'm going to use an arbitrary number, but if the market rent would have been $2,000, but the affordable rent is $1,500, and you offer the accessory dwelling unit at the affordable rent, half of that $500, $250, you could take as a tax credit up to $10,000. So it's an income tax credit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the other is a property tax credit that local governments could offer. So, again, I'm going to use an arbitrary number. say your house is assessed at $750,000. You build an accessory dwelling, and the tax assessor comes to town because you've gotten a building permit, and now because you have an accessory dwelling unit, your $750,000 house is worth $850,000. Another disincentive to doing it legally because your taxes are going to go up. So what the legislation would do would allow the towns to provide for a tax exemption for that increase, that extra $100,000. They could give a tax exemption so that you wouldn't be penalized with an increase in property taxes for creating an ADU.
That's really terrific, Fred. You hit the three major incentives right on the head there in terms of things that are disincentivizing people from building ADUs, and why we have such a huge shadow inventory of ADUs that are not permitted right now. So the process for that, you're hoping that that's going to be discussed and dealt with in the next couple of months?
Out of the governor's proposal, which did not succeed, we put together a working group in the assembly. We've got some members from New York City. We've got some members from upstate, some members from Long Island. And, the city has their own kind of unique issues with illegal apartments, which they'd like to see legalized, which, some of the problems with that we saw in some tragic consequences of people that died in basement apartments when the remains of Hurricane Ida came through and, flooded some areas of the city. So we're trying to deal with all of those issues and come up with a comprehensive strategy with regard to ADUs. I'm not sure that we will, we'll finish that work before the end of this session. Hopefully, maybe we can get some of it done, but we're in it, to come up with some solutions. So we may be able to move some of these things out this year, but if we don't finish this year, we're going to continue on with the proposals on accessory dwelling units
after the summer and into the fall session.
Yeah, the sooner the better, right? And we're going to see how much we can get done this year. But I'm mindful about how there was a lot of controversy that came out of the governor's proposal. It takes a little bit of time to kind of calm all of that down and then get everybody back on board and talking constructively. And that's what we're trying to do now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for tonight. It's already 8:07. We've been here longer than an hour. We really appreciate your time. And Bryony, do you want to take us out? It's been great to be with you.
Yes. Assemblyman Thiele, thank you so much. I have learned so much more than I knew when I walked in here an hour ago. And, I feel like we're all just getting armed with the facts and strategy to make this really a reality come November 8th. So thank you.
Yep. One last point. I know there were questions we didn't get to. If folks want to get those, if you want to collect those questions in a place where I could respond to folks, get their email address, I'll try to answer all the questions we didn't have a chance to get to tonight. Because I saw a number of them, and some of them are really good questions. We just didn't get to them. So if you can collect them for me and maybe I can give you the responses you can get back to folks, but any questions we didn't get to, I'm glad to try to answer and to get folks the answers to.
Perfect. That is a great plan. That's what we'll do. We'll get them all together, email them to you, Fred, and then your response we will send out to our YIMBY email list, and everybody can get your responses.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.